Hello and welcome to Foresight. I'm your host, Ken Weaver. For the past 25 years, SATV has been host to a variety of guests, from business leaders to politicians, educators, and artists, just to name a few. Today is unlike all others, as who you're about to meet has the responsibility of setting the course of one of the top 10 museums in America. With that said, it is indeed an honor to introduce the new Executive Director of the Peabody Essex Museum, Mr. Brian Patrick Kennedy. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
So, your history of curating and running museums, being the CEO of, I believe, 7 other museums? 8?
No.
No?
This is my 4th.
This is your 4th?
As CEO, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's 6 books, though?
Yeah.
Am I right with that?
Yeah, I've written 6 books and edited others, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so the books were, I know you have a degree in both history and art history as well.
Mm-hmm.
So are the books relative to things that were a part of that education, or?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I started off, my first book was my master's thesis, actually was about an Irish-American art collector called Sir Alfred Chester Beatty. And my second book was actually my doctoral thesis, which was also about arts policy and the development of that in Ireland, in post-independence Ireland. And then I did a whole series of books on Irish art and art history, Irish painters, before I did work on, beginning to work on visual history and text as image and image as text, that sort of idea. Mm-hmm. And I also did books with some major contemporary artists, one who's Irish-American, Sean Scully, and another who's American, Frank Stella. But I edited 6 other books as well with other people, so I had a significant publishing period which has proved more difficult to keep going over recent times because of just bigger institutions. But I'm always writing something, so I'd write articles in the year anyway. Right. And I love writing. Well,
that's great. I mean, it enlarges your life, really, because you're getting things out of you. And
yeah.
So your thesis was on, would you go back to that in the beginning, the person
my
you wrote about?
For my master's thesis, so when I was actually when I was a kid in Dublin, it was actually when my mother was expecting the last of 5 children, who arrived a lot later than everybody else. The gynecologist actually had an office on Shrewsbury Road, which is a very sort of posh road in Dublin. Mm-hmm. But there is the Chester Beatty Library. There was. It subsequently moved to Dublin Castle. And it was the repository of the collections of an Irish-American art collector called Sir Alfred Chester Beatty, who came to Dublin in 1950. And he gave his whole collection to the government of Ireland. And it's one of the most extraordinary collections anywhere of Islamic and Oriental and Western manuscripts and artifacts. And anyway, I was fascinated by it, and nobody had really studied his life, and his life as an art collector and how he went about collecting. Mm-hmm. So that's what I took up as my first thesis.
I made the comment to you when I think when I first met you, so that so when you were a young boy, you never wanted to be like a firefighter. You always wanted to be the curator. And
well, I was an Eagle Scout, but that was about it. Oh. Yeah, no, I wanted to be an architect like my father, actually, for quite a while. But by the time I went to college or finished school at 18, I'd had 5 years of real engagement with studying the history of art. Right. And so I went to college to study the history of art. So I'm one of those really, really lucky people that what was my hobby became my career. Yeah.
So your first museum was actually in Dublin, was it?
Yeah, actually. Right? Well, when I was doing my thesis, I worked at the Chester Beatty Library. My first job in museums at the National Gallery of Ireland, and I was incredibly fortunate. After my degrees, I went into the public service, and I was working in the Ministry for Finance, but I was responsible for the cultural institution budget, so I got to know the people there, and I was, giving talks and whatever in art history. So one day I was just stopped in the street by the human resources manager of the National Gallery of Ireland, who said to me, you know, Raymond got the job. And Raymond was the assistant director of the National Gallery of Ireland, who'd just been made director. And she said to me, like, would you be interested? And I remember looking at her, I said, do you think I could do that? You know, I was like, what was I? I was 26. Yeah. Oh. No, not 26, I was 28. And anyway, I applied for the job and I got it. And so my first job was as essentially Deputy Director of the National Gallery of Ireland for 8 years. And jobs were not easy to come by in cultural institutions because there weren't many cultural institutions in Ireland. Right. So I was just extraordinarily lucky to be in the right place at the right time, you might say. And then that catapulted my career. I went to Japan, I think, a dozen times. I went to America, I went to Australia. By virtue of going to Australia, I got to know the people there. And then one day we got a phone call in Dublin from the retiring director of the National Gallery of Australia, who asked me, you know, would you be interested in applying for this job? And of course, like...
And what are you doing for the next 8 years?
Yeah, like, so I'd never thought of leaving Dublin. And we just bought a beautiful home 3 years before that. My wife said, you know, we'd take her out of it in a box, you know, and then 3 years later we moved and went to Australia. So what do you know?
Yeah. So given what's happening in Australia, do you still have people in Australia who you're familiar with?
Yeah, actually, we go back regularly, and we went after the holidays this year. We were there in January for 2 weeks. Oh. And so the first week was horrendous, really. We were very fortunate that our friends' houses that we were staying with weren't burned, but they were under very serious threat. And we got caught in the fires south of Sydney, and we were evacuated not once but twice. The second time we were trying to drive to Canberra, which would be a 4-hour drive, and it took us 26 hours. We were in extraordinary traffic jam, not moving, and it was very, very frightening. I mean, the fires, the whole history of fire and the way fires can be considered is going to change on the basis of what's happened this year.
Right. Right.
Terrible.
Well, that must have been an extraordinary experience, not just going there now, but being there when you were there.
And dealing with the old issues of climate change and of fluctuations of climate. You know, they had, fire creates its own weather storms, and in Canberra, like subsequently after we left, they had a hailstorm where they the size of tennis balls and destroyed 20,000 cars. So, you know, it's just, I mean, the climate change issue and the realities of what's happening around the world are exactly what the vast majority of scientists have predicted are going to happen. And they're experiencing that now in Australia.
So from Australia, you moved on to where?
Yeah, I'd always wanted to come to America, and so, I mean,
the Hood?
Yeah, I came to Dartmouth College. I was approached by the Hood. They brought me 3 times from Australia for interview, which certainly made me realize they're taking it very seriously. But
not to mention jet lag from the.
Yeah, but I knew that, you know, fundraising is very different here. I'd worked for government institutions essentially that had some private fundraising, and Dartmouth is, you know, really excellent at fundraising, and has extraordinary collections in a very, very stitched-on alumni base, one might say. And I had a wonderful 5 years there. Great leaders in Jim Wright, who was longtime president, who was succeeded by Jim Yong Kim, who went on to lead the World Bank. And you know, I had from them to all the different people that I met, it was just an intellectual ferment of engagement with, you know, for a curious person like me, just fantastic. Every day I would have a lunch with somebody with a different speciality. And we really drove the arts and contemporary art at Dartmouth. So I had a ball. Yeah, in Hanover, New Hampshire. Yeah.
So while you were there, we were still here. We still had the PEM here.
Right.
Where had you had
I visited
time
here
to come down and visit? Or?
Yeah, indeed. And John Parker, who was the chair of the board, he was a Dartmouth alum, but he's married to Libby Parker, and John's passed away now. Olivia's a great photographer, but she's the sister of Charles Hood of the Hood Museum of Art. Oh. So like the network of New England was just playing out amazingly. And I watched, like everybody, what was happening here at Salem. I mean, the most extraordinary transformation of any museum in America over the last 25 years. That's what's happened here in Salem.
Yes, indeed. And you're right in the midst of it, and it's only going to get better.
I hope so.
Tell.
Yeah.
So from Dartmouth to
Toledo, Ohio, and so I was
to the Midwest, from the Northeast.
Yeah.
To basically the Midwest, right?
I've always just plowed my own furrow, you know. I mean, we're in a very competitive field where there just really aren't a lot of people who, you know, have the skill set to do this sort of thing and have a real knowledge of art. So when I was approached by Toledo, you know, I'd worked in national institutions. I'd now worked in a university or college institution, right? But I'd never worked in a civic institution, like where the identity of the city was tied around its museum, very, very much so in Toledo.
Right.
And it's one of the great museums of America, with a great endowment and extraordinary collections and people who just love it and great visitation. But in a city that needed to be uplifted like most Midwest cities, and I had 9 years there of essentially being a museum director who was a community leader.
Right.
And I was invited into lots of different organizations, you know, onto the board of the biggest hospital system, you know, being able to bring people like the, you know, great leader of the Toledo Mud Hens and Walleye teams, who are great marketeers, and many others, you know, together. And, you know, I mean, together, I think we all lifted Toledo, and everybody would say that. And I watched how this great city literally rose in its downtown again, which is now thoroughly vibrant. It means a lot of work to do still. And that was just a wonderful 9 years, which came to an end then middle of last year when the capital campaign was finished, the master plan was finished. Really, the second strategic plan was completed, and we launched a third one. And then I was approached about PEM. So
it is a small world, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, the degrees of separation are a lot fewer than 6.
Yes.
You know, they really are. Yeah, today.
I've experienced that myself. Being here, I think it's changed that as well. Your family. So you're settled here now in Salem.
Yes. Yeah. Very happily. It's been an extraordinarily welcoming community. I mean, people make things happen. So you got to get to know people, and they got to know you. Yeah, so we settled in a home here in Salem after Thanksgiving. We'd been living right beside the museum for 5 months, which was sort of a window on, you know, PEM that few people probably have had with such proximity. And that was a real gift, personally, I felt.
Yeah.
Our family are nearby as well. Our son is here in Salem, but our daughter had never left New Hampshire when we went to Toledo, so she like stayed the decade in New Hampshire. And she and her husband, they had a baby last year, and they're expecting again. So we have one grandchild already, and so an hour away. And so if you can imagine, we went all the way around the world to end up in Salem, Massachusetts, within an hour of our nuclear family, and in the city in America that is closest to Dublin by flight, like 5.5 hours, and you're over there. So, yeah, it's been a great gift, yeah, and we look forward to see how it all plays out.
So, just for a minute, in Toledo, I remember reading that the art was vastly, it spanned a great deal of things. And I know you had Matisse, you had Ringo, you had all those painters. And is there anything in Toledo, in Australia, in Hood, and that sticks out in your mind of something like that's an art piece that you prefer, that you like? Is there any kind of art that you really put a handle on and say, okay, well, this is, do I like abstract or do I like?
No, I've had a practice for 30 years, where I change a postcard in my office every week.
Oh.
Because I have thousands of postcards, but I keep shoe boxes of them in my office, and I start from the front and I work my way back, and the one that I pick is actually something related to how I'm feeling at that time.
Oh.
Right.
So this is like therapy, or is it?
It's a sort of therapy. I shouldn't tell you this, but you know, for people who look at it, they say, well, why is that there this week? Well, it obviously has to have a resonance to me.
Sure.
So if you parlay that to art, I mean, I'm naturally curious and sort of a magpie that way. I spent 10 years trying to understand abstract art and wrote a lot about it and studied it.
How'd you make out with that?
Well, I think I learned a heck of a lot about it. What I learned is that it's in its infancy. I mean, contemporary abstract art is really only 100 years old. Of course, abstract art is as old as, you know, people making marks on stones in caves. It's earlier than representation as we know it. But, you know, representational art was what I was educated into. PEM offers, you know, windows on whole parts of the world that are hugely populous today.
Oh, yeah.
And extraordinary collections about which I know very little personally. I'm not an expert in any way, but that have great beauty to them and intrigue. So, you know, I'm always avaricious for
something
new knowledge, yeah.
Right, right.
There's plenty of it at PEM, I tell you.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. How are you changing the schedules of any of your exhibits, or is that all that kind of written in stone? How that's going to work?
No, it's not written in stone, but you're always planned 2 years out. So, like, we were already 2 years from last July, and now, you know, we're looking into 2022 right now. But it means that okay, there's a rhythm that has to be completed because it was already started.
Sure.
But we can pace things differently. I think we were going really at a frenetic pace for a very long time, and a lot of the reaction of staff in initial conversations with me was to sort of, you know, can we just breathe? And, you know, building new buildings all the time. So that stage is over. But as we pivot to being not just about exhibitions, but also about programming to engage the community, and so all sorts of educational public programs that would occur within the museum and outside the museum, we have to rebalance our staffing and you know, start to think about the permanent collections as well as the temporary exhibitions, think about the historic houses as well as the new buildings. I've described it as a sort of an exercise in both and, whereas we were sort of more in either or. So we're and a maritime museum, you know, we're and Salem history. It's both. But because we were directionally going one way for a long time, it's a big ship, and it will take time to rebalance it. But that's the overwhelming desire of the community. There's no doubt about it.
Right. A little over a year ago, I think, we had a move where a lot of the artifacts were taken from Salem and moved to warehousing in Raleigh, I believe.
Yes.
Have you had the opportunity to go there and see how that operation is working?
Oh, certainly, and to engage with the community who felt very strongly about that. It's an incredible facility. Most major art museums, and PEM is now a very major museum of art and culture in this country, you know, top 10 by scale, there's no doubt. So it has huge collections, and the major museums are looking to how do they preserve them for the future. And that's a significant obligation, especially in places like Salem, which are like at water level, at sea level.
Yes.
And so what's the preservation for the future? And what's the way that the collections will interact with digitization? Because most people won't touch the original manuscripts moving forward from a preservation point of view. I mean, they can, but not generally. And, you know, just like Ancestry.com, I mean, an awful lot of it is going to be done in the digital realm. So digitizing our collections is really, really important. To do that, you have to have photographic studios, proper storage. So this is far from being only a warehouse. It was a warehouse, a great toy distribution warehouse where we have this building. But what it is a huge, big, rectangular box that is being air-conditioned and racked, storage racked, for all different kinds of precious materials. And already the Phillips Library is, has been you know, stored and shelved, but in a way that gives it an access and a possibility for retrieval that was just impossible where it was. Now, there's been a significant loss for the community in the sense that people liked the idea that it was here. And so we have to rebalance what is here and show Salem history here and interact with the community as we build the sort of Salem experience maybe more amply than it has been to date.
Right.
And I mean, I invite everybody to come to Rowley and see what it is. It's not as beautiful as Plummer and Dayland. We've spent $12 million on Plummer and Dayland. It's not even open yet. Maintaining historic buildings is extraordinarily expensive. And the community can't do that itself. So, you know, I've certainly got a job. We've got a lot to do.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So it is vitally important, the use that's being put on it to protect and curate and hold those art pieces that are there. It's for their own protection, basically.
For their protection, but for their access, because you have to be able to get access to them in, you know, open space. But also like distribution. So, like very quickly, and this is going to happen increasingly over the years, but very quickly, for example, several thousand photographs of the history of Salem were able to be put up onto the internet and free access that people can download. So there's a whole realm of material that was associated especially with the Essex Institute that has to be treated that way. There's already so much. I mean, all the logbooks and journals of all the sailors have already been digitized. It's about distributing that and making sure that there's access to them. So, you know, it's a very large library, but about a third of the entire there is only known at PEM. So this is not like a normal library. It's a research library. And it's a private research library, but in the public interest. And so I think it's going to take some time, and we just didn't have the resources, and we hadn't had the emphasis. But the future is very, very bright for the Phillips Library.
Oh, that's good to know. It's always good to know. I held one question that I was speaking to you earlier as we walked in here. You know, I see our history, you know, as the walls on the caves, the painting of the hunt, you know, where leather and shells at one time were pieces of currency.
Right.
And we have all of those things. But my curiosity of history and what will become art is how and what do you think art is going to turn into in 200 years or even 100 years from now?
Well, we already have within our lifetime, but especially in the last 25 years, a turn in the art market where, you know, half the art market is actually associated with digital film and video. So the contemporary art market has morphed into having, you know, media that we've been familiar with for a long, long time, but also new media and dissemination that's only recent. Now that can only grow in an era of, well, for us, I mean, what's it going to be called in 100 years' time, 200 years' time? But what we look to as virtual reality or augmented reality now is going to give rise to opportunities for art making and experience making that we can't even imagine now. That said, I do think as human beings who have a relationship to time and space, that's our essentially way of moving around the world, that the existence of objects which are the markers of the creativity of people over time is essentially our history and as people. And so I think that the traditional aspects, just in the way of, you know, digital didn't kill the book. You know, libraries are still thriving and bookshops are still alive. You know, book groups are still on the go. We may have Audible, we may have whatever. There will be different forms of access. But I think that the fundamental concept of a museum as a trove of artifacts of the history of humankind, it will continue. People are people, they're communicative animals, and they want to associate by telling stories, and we tell stories through objects. So goodness knows what it's going to look like. And one thing I can say is that PEM is already the repository of huge numbers of objects of the very countries that have caused the expansion of the world's population from 1975 at 4 billion to what will be 8 billion, you know, by 2025. And so when we think about China or we think about India, or we think about Nigeria, or we think about Pakistan, you know, these countries that have exploded in populations, we are probably the most significant repository of that collective of countries in this entire country of America. Right. That kind of future-proofs us. I mean, somebody said to me the other day, very interesting, we think about Mandarin growing. With the rate, China, of course, has contracted its population by population control. So Mandarin has a bit of a restriction on it. Africa is growing so fast, and French is the leading language of Africa, that French is going to rise in the next 20, 30 years. So these kind of balancing forces, which are demographic and global, are at the essence of what we can at least look in terms of data prediction for the future. But you know, you might as well ask somebody else just as much as me. I mean, I can't read the future, but I can guess at it like everybody.
I guess my only concern about that aspect is we're placing our information so much in technology. And as we all know, technology changes so quickly.
Yes.
That the means to be able to access all the technology that's created, that holds as a repository of all the information, if people are not able to keep up with that technology, then that technology is not and is unavailable. Don't we lose some of that along the way?
Yeah, there are already losses. I mean, there's certainly a loss to, for example, just the immediacy of access of, you know, keeping all the postcards that people sent you over the summer, right? To having them all go into your digital computer, right? And now they're there forever, but like, do you ever look at them, right?
Right.
So there's that loss, which is, there's a gain that is actually a loss. So we have you know, the ephemeral nature of an awful lot of archive systems, because they have to have some sort of cutoffs as to what's included and what's not included. So there are all sorts of aspects to this, but I think generally speaking, we haven't had a problem keeping up with technology. I mean, there've been redundant technologies that have fallen away. I mean, I've just moved house. I'm wondering, what'll I do with all my DVDs and my CDs, and do I really need them anymore? And
where do I get another player?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Or have you got a cassette tape recorder? You know, I mean, what about this shoebox of cassettes I just found, that I made and put together my top 20 and all that stuff?
This is my point.
Yeah. And so there's no doubt that we are seeing a revolution, but nonetheless, I mean, all those songs are archived somewhere, and we will be able to stream them, and it's just a different formula. So you know, I have. The speed, I mean, I was in China recently, and which is already in 5G in its cities, and you know, somebody in front of me, they downloaded a feature film in 20 seconds on their phone. I mean, that's what that means. I mean, so the pace of technology is just something that's already there in the military and in other sectors. So I've never worried about that. It's controlling the technology is going to be the issue.
You have been more than gracious with us, and it has been a total delight to have you here. And hopefully you'll be sitting in that chair again someday.
Please God, I'd love to, yeah. And congratulations on all you're doing here. I think, you know, the whole development of community access television in this country, and what it gives people a feeling of involvement in a building community is something I totally support. So,
oh, that's wonderful to hear.
Good for you.
That's wonderful to hear.
Okay. Pleasure.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
And that was a conversation with the new executive director of the Peabody Essex Museum, Brian Kennedy. I hope you enjoyed this, and we will see you again soon. This is Ken Weaver for Foresight. Thank you for joining.